Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that's in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead?, the book by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series known as Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. Some time ago in the Wall Street Journal, he did an article on the scientific evidence for God. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue looking at Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead?, and part 2 deals with the archaeology behind the stories of the Bible. And this time we're going to discuss the discovery of the Nazareth home of Jesus. Ken Dark is the main character in the story. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was the question Cynics in Jesus' day sarcastically asked, assuming that the town of the far north could never be the place from which the Messiah would come. Of course, it is indeed where Jesus, whom billions call the Messiah, came from. There's never been any question about that, nor about whether his home there once existed. But whether it survived, or ever could be discovered again, never seemed at all very much worth being concerned with. First of all, on the face of it, the idea that a simple home built over 2,000 years ago would survive and eventually be identified as belonging to anyone specifically seems absurd. Yeah, why could, I doubt that many of us would assume that many of the houses or locations in which we currently live will be able to be discovered 2,000 years from now. And in this case, we're talking about a very out-of-the-way village or town called Nazareth, and about an unknown carpenter or builder named Joseph, who raised his family of several children there, including his eldest, that one called Jesus. This would have been where his wife, Mary, raised their children and cooked their meals. At this place, both the town and the house itself would have been distinguished principally by being undistinguished. It didn't seem special at all. It seemed like a normal, everyday house for the time period. This was not a palace or any kind of structure that was any different from the innumerable other structures built throughout what we call the Holy Land. Yeah, it's not going to be ornate like Solomon's temple or the tabernacle in the way that it was built. There's nothing that's going to make it seem like it's special. It reminds one of the prophecy, I believe, from Isaiah that refers to Isaiah 53, that refers to him seeming somewhat normal. There's one of the verses in that passage that sort of speaks to that. It would have been a very simple home for a working-class family in an obscure village. Why should any such place survive beyond a century or two? And if for some reason it did survive longer than a century or two, and even survived 2,000 years, but was buried beneath the sands of time and the rubble of succeeding structures, how in the world would we ever be able to suspect or reason that it was that abode, that it was that abode precisely in which dwelt their now impossibly famous figures? That woman praised above all women who ever lived, referring to Mary, that man whom billions call the Messiah of the world, Jesus, and God incarnate in human form. How could we know that it had Mary and Jesus in it? And if we did know, how would we react to that place? What human sense could it make that the humble home of figures undistinguished in their lifetimes would survive or ever come to be found? We have no idea where most of the famous figures from antiquity grew up, unless they were royalty, such as Alexander the Great, in which case we might conceivably be able to discover their palaces. But who can find the childhood homes of the most famous men of ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle? In more recent centuries, however, when someone becomes famous, we usually do take the trouble to discover in which buildings they grew up and somehow mark that place. We know precisely, for instance, where Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa in 1451. That's supposed to be where Christopher Columbus was born. The actual house was demolished in the 1680s, but in later years, the original was reproduced, and tourists can visit it, and that must be the very reproduced house of Christopher Columbus. The restored home of Shakespeare, built in the 1500s, still stands and can be visited. There's a picture of that. The 600-year-old home where Joan of Arc was born in 1412 is still standing and can be visited in the village of Domremy-la-Pucelle. I don't know how you say that. And apparently I couldn't find a picture of the home of Joan of Arc. But go back to the 1340s when Chaucer was supposed to have been born in London and see what you can find. Absolutely nothing, though he's considered the father of English literature. There's nothing commemorating the home of Geoffrey Chaucer. The relatively recent cabin in which Abraham Lincoln grew up in Kentucky has vanished, although its sandstone foundation has been preserved. So two things are at work. On the one hand, the past tends to vanish. Why should anyone remember or preserve the unremarkable home of someone who lived and died many centuries before? And yet, we see that as soon as the aforementioned figures become famous, every effort was made to find and preserve their childhood homes. We also know that the figure of Jesus, who grew up in Nazareth and who died by Roman crucifixion in the early 30s AD, may have been an absolutely obscure figure for the first 30 years of his life, but in his final 3 years he became extremely famous for, among other things, miraculously healing the lame and crippled and bringing sight to the blind eyes from birth. He was in those 3 years followed by vast crowds throughout the countryside, and it was after the miraculous resurrection of Lazarus. After resurrecting Lazarus, he was more celebrated and sought after still, so that Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem was greeted with waved palm branches and with cries of Hosanna, and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There was a lot of publicity and varying opinions about Jesus, but one thing was undeniable, that he was a miracle worker and that there was a special power at work in him. And of course, shortly after his death, many thousands believed he was God incarnate, and were so fervent in this belief that many of them went to their deaths before they would renounce it. In fact, tradition holds it that most of the disciples died martyrs' deaths, with the exception, I believe, of the Apostle John, who died in exile. We also know that those who believed in him did not get wiped out, but continue to grow in number, despite the most brutal persecution imaginable at the hands of the merciless Romans. So yes, the first century church was born right after Jesus' ascension, the book of Acts, and continued and is still going strong to this day. But we also know that in 313 AD, in the Edict of Milan, Constantine did something so dramatic that it changed the world of his time and ever since. He declared that the Christian religion should be tolerated throughout the Roman Empire. He had himself become a Christian, and suddenly the cruel persecution and murder of Christians ceased, because the emperor became a Christian. But then he appointed his mother, Helena Augusta Imperatrix, giving her unlimited funds to travel throughout the Holy Land to recover all relics of the Christian faith that she could find. Since only 230 years had passed since the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, and Helena and many after her were able to identify and uncover many Christian holy sites. So there was a lot of stuff that Helena was able to find that commemorated the early church. For example, the grotto where Jesus supposedly had been born was known by Christians who had worshipped there for decades. But in 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, as a way of wiping out any trace of this revered site as the birthplace of Jesus, had a temple to Adonis built over it. He had a temple of Adonis built over the grotto where Jesus was born. Nonetheless, the sacred memory of it could not be wiped out, and in 248 AD, Origen of Alexandria wrote, quote, "In Bethlehem, the cave is pointed out where he was born, and the manger in the cave where he was wrapped in swaddling clothes. And the rumor is in those places and among foreigners of the faith that indeed Jesus was born in this cave, who was worshipped and reverenced by Christians," end quote, by Origen. By the time Helena got there, it was still recognized as the birthplace of Jesus, so she had the temple torn down and a Christian basilica built over it. 200 years later, it was torn down in a Samaritan revolt, but not long after that, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian had it rebuilt once more. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian had the temple rebuilt once more, and so it went through the centuries, so that today we know exactly where it is, which is itself both astounding and understandable when one knows the facts. Helena also discovered the place on the Mount of Olives where Jesus was said to have ascended into heaven and built a church of Eleona there, which was eventually destroyed by the Persians in 614 AD, although its remains have been found. As we see over and over, these sacred places have been marked over the centuries and millennia, both by their protectors and detractors. Although the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, they spent the next 2 centuries rebuilding it in their own imperial image. When Helena arrived, she learned that Hadrian also desecrated the place of Jesus' burial by building a temple to Jupiter above it, just as they had built a temple of Adonis over Jesus' birthplace in Bethlehem. But Helena had this temple demolished too, and her son had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built there, which was commissioned in 335 AD. So these examples and many others show that relatively early on, many of these holiest Christian sites were remembered and memorialized. They wanted to keep the history of these Christian sites intact. Even after some had been desecrated, and that churches and other memorials were built on top of them. So the link to the past in many cases has indeed been preserved, and what we still know of these very earliest sacred sites can be astounding. So it sounds like Metaxas is building the case that, contrary to maybe a lot of popular belief, that something so old can be located and identified with confidence. So we have stories of these other places that we've read through about their survival. And so it becomes more reasonable to think that the home of Jesus of Nazareth could survive and be discovered and be found and still be viewed today. Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, was never a traveler's Mecca and was a full 100 miles north of Jerusalem, so we are hardly surprised to learn that Helena never made it there. But we know that in the year 680 AD, a Frankish bishop named Arculf visited the Holy Land and Nazareth. On returning home, his ship was wrecked on the coast of Iona in Scotland. The bishop in Iona then was a certain Adoman, who welcomed Arculf and heard his detailed story of what he had found in the Holy Land, later putting it all in a book titled De Locus Sanctus, on Holy Places. But what Adoman wrote 13 centuries before our time came into play rather recently when some excavations were done in Nazareth, as we shall see. 12 centuries passed with no mention of Nazareth germane to our discussion, but in 1881, the French Sisters of Nazareth moved there to build a convent. Not long after they began, they discovered an ancient cistern. Along with the workmen that they employed, even some children from the school they ran, they began to excavate the area. The Biblical Archaeological Society wrote, quote, "The nuns exposed a complex sequence of unusually well-preserved archaeological features, including Crusader period walls and vaults, a Byzantine cave church, Roman period tombs, and other rock-cut and built structures. The nuns made a small museum of the pottery, coins, glass, and other portable artifacts that they recovered. Then construction of the new convent buildings revealed the walls of a large Byzantine church with a triple apse, polychrome mosaic floors, white marble fittings rebuilt in the Crusader period," end quote. So that's what was found in the location where the French Sisters of Nazareth moved, that they discovered. So the Sisters of Nazareth and the workmen they employed found these things. Across the street was the Church of the Annunciation, which was the traditional site of Mary's childhood home, the But the large Byzantine church that the nuns discovered was the long-lost Church of the Nutrition, supposedly the site of Jesus' home in Nazareth. It was that place our cult visited in the late 17th century, as we shall see, for he mentions it as being above Jesus' home. But evidently in 721 AD, Caliph Yazid II had it destroyed because the next account from a pilgrim to Nazareth comes to us from St. Willibald in 725 AD, who makes no mention of it. It seems the sisters had found this church, but neither they or anyone else had any idea of its extraordinary significance, and although they continued to excavate the site in fits and starts for some time, they never learned the reason this church stood where it did. So another long century would pass before any other serious excavation was done. And in 2006, a full investigation began into the site under the supervision of Ken Dark of Reading University in England. It was only at this point that the lengthy chronological sequence of well-preserved structures and features began to reveal itself when Ken Dark got his hands on it. This included the successive Crusader and Byzantine churches, 2 early Roman period tombs, a phase of small-scale quarrying, and of the greatest significance of all, and the very reason for all the other magnificent structures, there was at the bottom of everything a rectilinear structure with partly rock-cut and partly stone-built walls. It finally became clear that exceedingly great pains had been taken through the centuries to mark this structure and to preserve it, precisely as we have observed in other similar holy sites, such as the supposed sites of Jesus' burial in Jerusalem and his birth in Bethlehem and Peter's home in Capernaum. So it became apparent to Dark that people had been at work for a very long time, multiple generations, multiple generations to preserve this edifice, and there must have been some reason for the emphasis on working so hard to preserve it. Perhaps the people who preserved it knew something about it, namely that it was the home of Jesus. Dark says the limestone vessels found at the site indicate that this home was part of a strictly Jewish community, for limestone vessels were not subject to Jewish impurity laws and were therefore very popular during that time among the Jews. The Jews were not going to have vessels that could be regarded as unclean, because that was something that was important to the Jews of the day. So they're going to have things that can't be designated as unclean, that they're not going to be subject to the impurity laws. Okay, so they're going to have a lot of those because they can use them easily. Many of the surrounding towns show greater acceptance of Roman culture. End quote by Dark. But one of the principal reasons Dark believes this first century home is the very place where Jesus grew up has to do with the workmanship. Quote by Dark, whoever built the house had a very good understanding of stoneworking, Dark says. Quote, that would be consistent with the sort of knowledge we would expect of someone who might be called a tekton, end quote, the ancient Greek word for craftsman that was used to refer to Joseph. Back to Dark. Quote, by itself, that's not got flashing lights saying this is where Jesus lived, but it's underneath a 5th to 7th century Byzantine church. That might be the end of the quote. We know now that the church built over this site was enormous, elaborately decorated, and probably a Byzantine cathedral of Nazareth. It wasn't the end of the quote. Its location and grandeur indicate to Dark that this particular place was considered really important. Its description by the Islamic Caliph Yazid in 721 almost wiped it from history forever. So the Islamic people were trying to destroy it. But 12 centuries later, the nuns arrived. The article continues. Quote, just inside the surviving doorway, and earlier excavations had revealed part of its original chalk floor. Associated finds, including cooking pottery and a spindle whorl, suggest domestic occupation. Taken together, the walls conformed to the plan of a so-called courtyard house, one of the typical architectural forms of early Roman period settlements in Galilee. The excellent preservation of this rectilinear structure or house can be explained by its later history. Great efforts had been made to encompass the remains of this building within the vaulted cellars of both the Byzantine and Crusader churches so that it was thereafter protected. End quote. So just beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent, the evidence of this extraordinary Byzantine church was found, along with a spring and 2 tombs in its crypt, which were certainly built sometime after Jesus' death and resurrection, since no one would have built a home so close to any tombs. The first century house was probably a courtyard house and stands between the 2 tombs. Both the tombs and the house were decorated with mosaics in the Byzantine period, suggesting they were of special importance, possibly venerated. So, during the Byzantine period, Byzantine people recognized this as a significant location, hence the decoration of it. But what is chilling is to read Adoman's account of this place from 680 AD. He clearly says that there were 2 churches at that time of his visit. And here's the picture of Adoman. I moved it over here. One was the Church of the Annunciation, and the other was across the street, being the Church of the Nutrition that we've mentioned. In his account, from over 13 centuries ago, Adoman, writing down what Arculf himself saw with his own eyes, says that it was between 2 tombs beneath the second church, precisely that one found the very house where Jesus had been raised by Mary and Joseph. So Adoman writes what Arculf saw and said that Adoman said that this was the very house where Jesus was raised by Mary and Joseph. There can hardly be anything more extraordinary than this discovery, although there's one thing that may come very close, and this is that news of this earth-shaking discovery. It's been so extremely poorly communicated that it has the misfortune of actually seeming intentional. Like nobody is talking about the fact that the Nazareth home of Jesus has reportedly been discovered. You would think that would be big news. An article about it appeared in Biblical Archaeology Review in 2015, although that itself was oddly tentative. Even so, nothing more was said on the subject, since as though the discovery of the actual home where the Holy Family lived wasn't worth looking into or was a subject too embarrassing for serious archaeologists. Only in late 2020 did Dr. Dark publish the book containing the findings of his continued excavation since 2006, but the book cannot help but strike one as almost calculated to hide the discovered pearl of great price, instead bizarrely focusing on the nesting wooden boxes in which the superlative pearl had been found. The book's title, for example, could not possibly be more underwhelming or beside the point, almost to the point of comedy. Here's the title. Sisters of Nazareth Convent, a Roman period Byzantine Crusader site in central Nazareth, at the Palestine Exploration Fund Annual. What a title. And there is the picture of the book by Ken Dark. With the picture of the house on the cover. Could anything be better engineered to bury the lead or to crush out a site, the infinitely important structure for which all of the subsequent structures were built, and which they wished to signify and celebrate to protect? Can we imagine that those who built these structures had any idea that what they built in this most hallowed location would be treated with equal or even more deference than the sacred structure they were so honored and privileged to enshrine? In case anyone could be tempted to buy the drearily titled volume, it was originally listed at $160, just to ensure it's only purchased by a handful of academic libraries and never read, though it's now been marked down, Metaxas says, to $138. I don't know too many people who are going to drop $138 for a book, except maybe a college student. Because college books are ridiculously expensive. But it is perhaps the publisher's description of the book that most astonishingly and bizarrely suppresses the very thing that ought to be not only its main point, but front page news in most newspapers. Here it is from Amazon. Quote from Amazon on the description of this book, The Sisters of Nazareth Convent by Ken Dark. This book transforms archaeological knowledge of Nazareth by publishing over 80 years of archaeological work at the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, including a detailed reinvestigation in the early 21st century under the author's direction. Although one of the world's most famous places and of key importance to understanding early Christianity, Nazareth has attracted little archaeological attention. Following a chance discovery in the 1880s, the site was initially explored by the nuns of the convent themselves, one of the earliest examples of a major program of excavations initiated and directed by women. Then for decades by Henry Scenes, whose excavations, like those of the nuns, have remained almost entirely unpublished. Their work revealed a complex sequence elucidated and dated by 21st century study, beginning with a partly rock-cut early Roman period domestic building, followed by a Roman period quarrying and burial, a well-preserved cave church, and a major service-level Byzantine and Crusader churches. The interpretation and broader implications of each phase of activity are discussed in the context of recent studies of Roman period, Byzantine, and later archaeology and contemporary archaeological theory, and their relationship to written accounts of Nazareth is also assessed. Sisters of Nazareth Convent provides a crucial archaeological study for those wishing to understand the archaeology of Nazareth and its place in early Christianity and beyond. They didn't even mention the fact that Jesus' childhood home is here. Publisher's description does not bother to mention that the partly rock-cut early Roman period domestic building that it does deign to mention is the only reason for everything that exists around it, and is the only reason anyone on planet Earth is aware of the existence of Nazareth. Yeah, he doesn't even mention Jesus in any way, other than to say that it had to do with Christianity. Nor did they mention as much as Jesus or Mary or Joseph, who built the home with his own hands. But they do mention what one gathers they see as the most exciting part of the find, saying it's one of the earliest examples of a major program of excavations initiated and directed by women. Sounds like something. It sounds like something that modern feminists who are looking to get glory for themselves and not give glory to God. It sounds like something that they would want said. The fact Jesus gives a special place to women in his ministry. That part is plain in the discovery of the empty tomb. You see that it is women who discover that the tomb is empty. There's a lot of misinformation about the Bible being oppressive to women, and Paul Copan talks about that. The book is God or Moral Monster. Look for videos for that on this channel that correct some of the new atheist misdiagnoses, misperceptions. Of course, these saintly French women would writhe in horror to think that they'd been singled out, but that the one to whom they wed themselves and whose life and person they wished to magnify in all they ever did, these nuns, including these excavations, was ignored entirely. Yeah, the sisters of the Nazareth convent. Yeah, they're not wanting. They're wanting to give glory to God, not detract from God's glory by having undue attention hoisted upon themselves. If ever one needed an example of how the bias against God in the Bible persists in the academic world, surely this example alone would suffice to make the point and close the case. So we have some ongoing discoveries going on. In addition to the Nazareth home of Jesus, you have a ring that was used by Pontius Pilate. You have a pomegranate from Shiloh. You have altar horn from Shiloh. and you have a purification bath. These are more archaeological discoveries that corroborate the biblical stories. So, archaeological discoveries corroborating the biblical accounts have continued steadily since the mid-19th century, but with improving technology and with the population of Israel growing, which has increased the number of building projects being undertaken, the rate of discovery seems to be accelerating. Here are a handful of the most recent. First, Pilot Ring. Looks like the picture on the right is like an X-ray type image of the image on the left. In 2018, a seal ring was found bearing the name of Pontius Pilate. Given the copper alloy of the ring, it's unlikely that it was worn by Pilate himself, but rather by someone who represented him and who would use it to give his authority to seal documents written in his name. The ring was so corroded over 20 centuries the ring was so corroded over 20 centuries that if not for state-of-the-art photographic imaging technology, the name would have been impossible to read. Also, in 2018, a seal was discovered bearing what is almost certainly the name of the prophet Isaiah. That previous sentence reminds me of earlier in this book you have the story of silver Ketef Hinnom scrolls, where that archaeologist with I can't think of his name right now. My recollection is that that's the chapter where they talk about needing some sort of imaging to unroll the scroll and to get the words on the scroll so that you could make out what the words were on the scroll. And it was the words that talked about the Lord make his face shine upon you, and that chapter, this book. So also in 2018, a seal was discovered bearing what is almost certainly the name of the prophet Isaiah. Further evidence toward this conclusion is the discovery, very nearby 3 years earlier, of a similar seal bearing the name of Hezekiah of Judah. Isaiah and Hezekiah are so closely linked in the scriptures that they appear together in 17 verses. So that's the end of the Pilate ring, the ring that contains Pilate's name. Now we're going to look at a Shiloh pomegranate. Apparently there's a lot of them. In 2019, a tiny ceramic pomegranate was found in Shiloh, precisely matching the description of those described in Exodus chapter 28, which God instructed the Israelites to sew into the robes of the high priest. Also that year, in some dirt near the Temple Mount, a tiny stone Becca weight was discovered. In Exodus 38:26 says that such a weight must be used to determine the precise amount of silver required as a donation during the time of the first temple built by King Solomon. At that time, the Israelites did not have coins, but simply pieces of silver, and this weight of 55 grams, or half a shekel, was the precise amount required. If anything could ever confirm this as the actual site of Shiloh, this tiniest of objects would certainly be it. Now we're going to look at an altar horn from Shiloh discovered by Scott Stripling. In Shiloh, Dr. Scott Stripling of Houston, Texas, continues to direct excavations at what he believes is the very site of the tabernacle in the wilderness where the Israelites worshipped from the time of Moses until the time of Solomon. The tabernacle was made of animal skins and, of course, itself would have decomposed millennia ago, but there have been numerable smaller discoveries that began to tilt judgment toward this site. A number of stone altars have been found, along with the aforementioned tiny ceramic pomegranate. God's directions in Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, are that the altar be made of earth, but if of stone, then not of stone wrought by anyone, lest it be polluted. The stone or stones used must be naturally shaped, and Dr. Stripling has found 3 that seem to fit this description, each with a protruding stone horn. For each of the 4 corners of the altar must have a horn, which signified strength. Now we're going to look at a mikveh purification bath. Most recently of all, at Christmas 2020, a building project at the foot of the Mount of Olives was halted when a mikveh purification bath was discovered from the time of Jesus. The location is very close to what is believed to be the Garden of Gethsemane. Mikveh baths were often located near places of oil or wine production. Spokesman for the Israeli Antiquities Authority explained, quote, Jewish laws of purification obliged workers involved in oil and wine production to purify themselves, end quote. The Garden of Gethsemane lies at the foot of the Mount of Olives, obviously known for the olive trees that grew there. But the word Gethsemane actually means oil press, and so the discovery of this mikvah bath from that period suggests that this area really was the location of an oil press since ancient times, therefore requiring a purification bath on that site. It also lends greater credence to the idea that Jesus, representing Israel, which was always identified with the olive tree, had come here to himself to be crushed and to endure the agony of accepting his Father's will for him. Now some conclusions. When archaeological finds in the mid-19th century began to confirm details in the biblical accounts, the heady promise of what might lie ahead was undeniable. But to be fair, no one could then know whether the initial and exciting confirmations of the biblical accounts were anomalies and whether over time the scales would tip in the opposite direction. That archaeology could show the accuracy of the Bible on historical and other details was then simply a theory. It would take more than a dozen decades and hundreds of excavations before we could see whether this theory was essentially correct or not. So for many decades, that was the question in the air. On which side would the evidence eventually pile up? As the digging and discoveries have continued, however, the welter of evidence has been overwhelming, rarely, if even once, speaking against the biblical record. So perhaps it is time to call the question. There will, and always should be, debate about certain individual discoveries, but can we at least agree that the general history has been affirmed? Even this minute, and at what seems an accelerating pace, new finds illuminate the Bible as something genuinely unique, as an extraordinary window of words through which we can see the distant past. And so perhaps the only real question now is whether those who have been unyielding in their skepticism can find the courage to see that such skepticism has been fairly and slowly but surely weighed in the balance and found wanting. Of course, if history is any guide, we can assume that there will always be those for whom the discovery of even a Babylonian wall bearing the words many, many tekel upharsin would be insufficient. What a pity. He's closing the chapter here by saying he's showing us evidence after evidence after evidence after evidence, and for some people it's just never going to be enough. It's just the way it's going to be, and what a pity. So next time we look at the discovery of Ur of the Chaldees. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.